poor Calvin Castine to have to do this all his life. And
Good morning, everybody, and welcome to Hometown Cable. Our program's called What's Going On Here, so it must be Sunday. My name is Bob Venn, Calvin Castine with the camera. Person on my right, if you don't know her, you don't know history. If you know anything about history, you know this lady. She is the former county historian, and long before that, and since then, she's just been a great historian. Addie Shields from Point of Rush, way out on the point. Good morning, Addie.
yes, good morning.
We've been wanting to talk to Addie for the last 3 years, and she's a busy lady, and finally Calvin made a date a week ago and didn't quite make it. You had company, and now we're here on the second day of 1996. First time I've said that.
Yeah, we're starting 96, yes.
You know, I was thinking years ago, I hope I make the year 2000. Of course, we never know what's going to happen. We never know what's going to happen around the corner.
Right.
Yeah. Well, Addie, thank you for being with us. Well, before we get into history and all of that, let's just talk about your history. Where you're from, your maiden name, and where you grew up, and a little bit about you.
I didn't know you were going to be interested in that.
Oh, heck
But
yeah.
I was born right here in Beekmantown. I've lived here all my life. I was Addie Lawrence, and I lived in the stone house where Lawrence Gagne's young Larry lives. I was born over there. And I went to school here, and I've traveled a little bit, but I like this area.
Oh, you got to go back further than that. Now, here, your mom and dad were who?
Oh, well, my old great-great-great-grandfather, William Lawrence, first settled on Isle of Mont, and in 1791, when Isle of Mont became a part of Vermont, William Lawrence lost his land over there, and he came over to Chazy Landing, and he threw up the first dock over there. The Saxes really but the Saxes put money into throwing out a 200-foot dock, and William Lawrence had the first dock, but went inland up to West Chazy, and his sons, and he had married Persis Wood, and Persis Wood's brother was Amasa Wood, who were the sawyers up there, and Amasa Wood, who had the mill up at Woods Falls and so forth, and his son Victor, who owned that Victorian house because he had Queen of the Harvest mill up at the second fault line, because you see the fault line that the Chazy River runs over, the first fault line is up there at the bend beyond the Catholic Church and beyond the rural cemetery, and then the other fault line is down there in Beekmantown in back of the John F. O'Brien house, which belongs to Fravaco now, okay? And which, and Victor Wood, of course, married Julia Palmer. The interesting thing about that is that when you look at the will, her father gave her the, what was it, $4,000 or $7,000 that she had borrowed, and the piano. She didn't have to pay it back, okay? But, and wait a minute now, Julia Palmer's father was the judge, the county judge in Clinton County. And so Victor Wood marrying her, you follow, and not only having that business up there, married well. And they built that house, which was the site of the old Eldridge, some of the first people that were there, because William Lawrence lived there right next to what's the little library in West Chazy. That was Lawrence's Corners. And where David Martin is the old Lawrence house where Putnam Lawrence lived.
Right. We knew that was called Lawrence's Corners. I heard that, but that's because of your relatives way back.
That's right. That's right.
I didn't know that.
My father, you know, all of the bit on West Chazy and War of 1812, with the soldiers coming down through and the British going home, and his old Putnams and William refuting and kind of having back talk to them as they were going back. My father could spiel out that business about your plowshares and so forth. And what my father enjoyed history too, but my father, I'll have you know, his father was ill, and my father took care of 2 families. We didn't have any welfare in that time. And when I entered school, I lived with my grandmother in East Beekmantown, because that was only 4 miles from Plattsburgh, and very often we walked. And the only opportunities when you got out of school was to go to the normal school for a 3-year possibility of teaching in rural schools that did not become specialized so that you taught certain graded system until following the Second World War in the 45s. Then our normal school became a university. And all right, so a young lady in the 30s, I graduated from high school in 34, and at that time the possibilities were you could go to the normal school in a 10-year program, in a 3-year program with a 10-year certification to teach, or you could go to Albany Business College or Plattsburgh Business Institute, or if you were so inclined, you could enter the nursing system, in which New York State offered a program whereby you had to have $100 and you had to have your uniforms and so forth, and you had to work in that New York State institution for 3 or 4 years, and it would be down to Poughkeepsie, down to Albany, over to Watertown, over to Augsburg. Those were the opportunities. Now in the summertime you could work up at Hotel Champlain, or you could go up the lakes. We don't realize in the development after Vern Planck Colvin came in 1874 and surveyed all of the Adirondacks, and then Teddy Roosevelt and so forth being interested in with all of the development up there, the Loon Lake House and so forth. People, the young people in the summertime, that was the money that they could have, was to go up there and be chambermaids and wait on tables, and the young men could work in the, okay?
So the opportunities for further education were those that you mentioned, that was it.
Oh, that was it.
But where was PBI, Plattsburgh Business Institute? Was that
Right
the one across from the library?
Absolutely. It looks like a small Butler building, only it's 2 stories. And I never knew exactly who ran it and so forth, other than that was where, and anyone who was professionally inclined in the business way, if you had money enough and your parents could support your living in Albany, you went down there to Albany, or you went to. I don't know what the fee was to go to Plattsburgh Institute. Now, when anybody went to Plattsburgh State Teachers, to the normal school, it cost you nothing. And at that time, I remember in my senior year, or I guess as a junior, somewhere in there as a filler I took typing, because of course I took liberal arts, you know, the Caesar and Cicero and the whole bit, and solid geometry and, you know, algebra and intermediate and geometry and solid. But somewhere I had time for typing, and Miss Quinlan, who was a business teacher, tapped me on the shoulder one day and said, "Would you like a job? I know where you can get a job." And she sent me down to the dime store, and I can't remember the interview, but I remember that, okay, so Mr. Cattell was the manager, and I worked there for about 5-6 years. And I know we started in at 20 cents an hour, and my Social Security number was a very early one with a 0308 starting it, you know. And I remember that on Saturday we got $1.87, and oh, we did a lot with that $1.87. I can remember for Christmas buying everybody a nice paring knife, you know, and an egg beater, and then working. I did have a compliment too in that I was capable enough that I was the only extra girl they hired all through February and March till the roads broke up, you know, until the snow and people could come into Plattsburgh in the anticipation of Easter and so forth. Yeah. But yes, I'm very North Country.
Right. Now, did Loretta take over from PBI?
I don't really know. I do know, though, that that Our Lady of Victory and the school out there had, and that was a very great place.
Our Lady of Victory.
Yes, I'm saying reputation-wise and in production. In fact, a lot of the young ladies that are working in offices right now are from Our Lady of Victory.
Oh yeah, my daughter, or Barbara.
Is that where Barbara went?
Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. She started over in Trinity, over in Burlington, and then decided she wasn't going to follow what she thought she was, and wanted to find herself. And I said, well, if you find yourself, you're going to find yourself at home, where you can do something. So we got her an apartment in Plattsburgh, and then she started going there, and she just great. It's a great. When you say PBI, or that area across from the used to be owned by Dr. Bickford. He was the operator of one of those business schools.
Along at the end. Along at the end.
Maybe.
When it kind of came up for sale, when it
40s and early 50s.
Right, when it was kind of struggling.
Yeah.
Because you do realize that all right, with Horace Mann in 1835 and with John Locke, who in Yale began to come forward to the fact that anybody that tilled the soil ought to own it. And that was almost in company with the education field that Horace Mann came through with. And so in Massachusetts, having the first I think teachers training school about 1835, then we in Albany followed on. But you see, our education system starts with in 1789 with our government coming together. The first thing, the very first thing in the state of New York at the end of the war, the first thing they did was change the name of King's College to Columbia. And in that clause they established the New York State University system, which is the part of our education system. And all right, and so having that college in Albany to teach, now wait a minute, to teach young ladies to be proficient, to teach in schools and so forth, young ladies and young men. We had a young man in the 50s, Nathaniel Gale, who walked all the way from, all right, if you know where Lawrence Gagne's stone house is, and you know where Lawrence Gagne himself lives.
No, I don't. But
Well,
look,
all right.
let's take a short break. We'll take a break here because this lady's going to go right on and on and on, and we'll
You
take a
don't
break.
want this.
And yes, we do. And we'll come right back. You're watching Hometown Cable. Thanks much. I thought as she was talking back there, we better try to indicate where her home was, the stone house. I'm not familiar with it as such. It's Route 22. Now explain to us, from the Beekman Town School, you go north.
From the Bigtown School, you go north, you go past the fire station, on Route 22,
Yeah.
over what is known as RAE's, Ray's Brook, because that brook goes down, that's the brook that goes in at the creek in Plattsburgh on Route 9, and go past Calvin Brumley's, and past Al Coron's on your right, and then up there in the distance, Lawrence Gagne's farm, and over the hill, that long distance over the hill, on the left is the stone house, the old Dominie house, which Ichabod Dawson bought in 1835, and Ichabod Dawson had been in Islamont, and his Charlotte married Daniel Webster Lawrence, who was my great-great-grandfather. All right, now how do we happen to talk about that?
That stone house is where you were brought up.
That's right.
That's your home.
That's right.
There was
Now
a farm there too. Your father had a
Yes.
farm.
Now, that's the pathway of the British. And when the British came down from Champlain into Chazy, the left wing of the British started to come down what is Route 9, and where the creek is, it was all abattis, and they got word, and so they divided, and the right wing went over Buckman's Swamp at 348 and went into West Chazy and encamped over there in front of Levi Atwood's, the stone house that's southwest of West Chazy, and then there's a very nice brook there. You know, if you're going to put some men down, if you're going to encamp with a regiment, you're going to have some water for them. And so they encamped all the way from the Minor Lewis farm, which became Will Scribner's, and then became Will Scribner's to I can't give you that, but anyhow, I can see the little fella. But then, and all right, and so that whole contingent came all across there, and the gentleman that led that had breakfast in the cellar of that house, which belonged, that stone house. I haven't done this very well.
I suppose this is as good a time as any. How the heck do you know all this?
Well, of course, as I told you, my father could recite what was in herds all by, you know.
He had herds. He was a scholar? Was your father a scholar?
Yes, my father, however, was dwarfed because he took care of two families. His father was asthmatic and couldn't work, and so he would always come home and do the farm work in the summertime, and then in the fall he would enter the job. I figured this one out. My poor father never heard this, but in the fall of the year he would enter the job market with the young children. And at the time that my father was entering the market, he was a butter maker. He worked for Floyd Smith. And he later show-fit cattle for Williams, who owned at Chazy Lake, Williams, who had the one of the controlling interests in the D&H, and bought that wonderful plateau up there in Chazy Lake where there's a very nice farm. My father took his herd to St. Louis, and oh, he could talk ragapple and all of the breeding that was being used at that time. But wait a minute now. At the time that the opportunities at the time that my father was a young man and entering, the only opportunities for young men then, you take Saks. All right, in Whitehall, New York, they had a telegraphy station whereby a telegraphy station whereby young people went to learn to be telegraphers in this railroad business. So this was very important, and it was opportunities. And the Delaware and Hudson paid well. The other bit is that some of those men, after having that, I think Lucy Sacks's husband, Emerson Sacks, was one of the persons who went with Grant Dustin, and then Emerson Sacks got into. Emerson Sacks had a brother, Arthur Atwood, who owned the Doan Farm, became a banker in Philadelphia, and I think through his relationship, Emerson Sacks and Grant Dustin both got into the banking business in the Cahoon Bank, which is the merchant's bank on the corner of Brinkerhoff and Margaret. My father did not have those opportunities, but he did do, and I know at the time he died, I've often thought, yeah, we tried to console him about that, but he would say I took care of my mother, because you can go to the nursing homes right now, and in all honesty, you could see people that really belong at home, at home, and
everybody's working and no one there to take care of them.
Yeah.
The wives work.
Yeah, and see, okay, my father did that other thing though.
Yes.
And to a detriment in his own. Now he worked for A.H. Marshall after my grandfather died, and they closed out the farm. But at that time, my grandmother, being a widow, went to work to keep house for Aunt Helen Marshall, and you see, Aunt Helen Marshall was Helen Lawrence. She was one of Putnam's daughters.
She was related to the A.H. Marshall?
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
Well, tell these people who A.H. Marshall was. A lot of people don't know what this was.
All right. Well, on the corner of Margaret and Bridge, Albert Marshall, I think it was Marshall, Lewis, and Riley for a time. And in West Chazy, the Louis Robinson house, that Lewis was a part of that arrangement, and Riley was related to him somehow or other. And they had the first franchises on cars. But he had Albert Marshall, and along Spears, as you went down River Street, those two people had the bins of screws and bolts, carriage bolts and machine bolts, before you started buying from Montgomery Wards and so forth. And the other person who would have had them would have been, I'm not sure whether they've been McHugh or McQuinney, and then Breedenberg's way up in Champlain. You follow?
Yeah, A.H. Marshall was that big store right on the southeast corner of Bridge and Margaret Street, and it was huge, 2 stories at least, maybe 3.
Because it was the cellar.
Yes. It was a hardware store in the order of a department store. It was beautiful in there.
Now, I like the way you said that, because upstairs they had very fine china.
They did.
They had the best china in the area, yes.
Best toys in the area.
Yes.
We remember you didn't buy much from Marshall. We used to say it was expensive, but it was because it was very
And Marshall
classy.
had a man on the road who covered, that business of man on the road changed it before you had the automotive area. People took a team and a wagon, and they had stacked up shirts and outfits and socks and boots and so forth, and serviced all the small stores from Plattsburgh all the way around to Malone and so forth. But Marshall, of course, had hardware, and then he had the franchises, wasn't it, for Zenith? And I can almost remember who, somebody just died that was one of his roadmen.
Very, very classy store. For people who are younger, in Plattsburgh, Plattsburgh has changed so much. Right behind the store, they owned all the way back to River Street, and they owned that whole corner. And just beyond River Street was the big store, clothing store, Wolf's.
That's right.
Big store.
And in back of Wolf's was the bakery, and in back of that bakery was A.H. Marshall's, and it's been torn down, but it was a very well-built building of brick. That was his hardware, just a minute, The warehouse. The
warehouse?
And they kept glass in there,
Yep.
and they had an individual who, a glazier, who put panes of glass in if you broke a glass or if you had a new window.
That whole area where that parking lot is with the Pal Blade Company made razor blades for years. Hired a lot of people. We're going off into areas. We'll be right back. Take a short break, and we'll come back and find out what happened to Addie when she left the normal school.
Oh, well, I should.
Okay, we said we would get back to you left normal school and you started to be a teacher.
Oh, yes.
And you were teaching where?
In Beekmantown, where the school is, where the consolidated school is, that was District 13, and I had 53 pupils in 8 grades. The smallest number I ever had was 46. That was a big
So you taught
district.
all 8 grades?
Oh, yes, and incidentally, something I was at the other day, Al Corn was there, and Al and Roger were always, they could have said I was a witch, you know, but they always speak so very nicely of me and say I was a good school teacher. And we did have a good time, and but we consolidated a great deal, and all my kids could read. And at that time, you bought a $3 pan of gunk. When you went away, I'm not sure where we found them, but when you went away for conference in the fall, the salesman would be there, and I remember that I bought a second pan also, and they would be the very first copiers. They were gel that was in a rectangular 8.5 by 11 pan, and you'd use them, okay, so I had 2 sets of books, especially arithmetic books. And so their homework would be in the book they own, but every day I would set up on that gel and run off enough copies so that each person had a set of that correlated with the project in arithmetic that they were doing at that time. And I did that from the 4th through the 8th grade, so that when I first came, you know, we would always have morning exercises, and children loved to sing. Oh, that was great. Plus, so that they would start in with their daily work, which started with arithmetic for them, and I would start with the little children. All my children could read. And then somewhere or other, John Ray was my mentor, and John Ray, who lived where the school is now, had a wonderful library, and I would have materials of his that I would read. We'd always keep a good book going, you know, like The Girl of the Limberlost by Gene Stratton Porter and so forth.
Now you started with the grand sum of how much money?
$25 a week.
$25 a week.
Yes, and you did owe $1 out of that. You paid for your school. You belonged to the school association.
You start your own fire in the morning too?
No, Calvin Brumley did that, and Calvin got probably $25 a year, but he was willing to do this, and he swept the school and started the fire. And you know, when people came, we had that outside place for clothes press. I've thought of it as, I go to the mailbox, which is way up the end of the road here, and boy, some of the times you're cold, and when you're heading back into the wind, I've thought of all the distance that as a little girl, I went to that school as a child, and you really would, you know, you'd get home and you were almost crying, you were cold, but it never did to cry, because that worsened the system. You know?
And you never had a bus either, right? There was no school
hang
buses.
on, of course.
Right. So you met a man by the name of Shields somewhere along the way.
Well, my mother and father made butter. And my father was a butter maker anyhow, and they had a route in Plattsburgh where they peddled butter. And you do realize that the commodity that a farmer had before the cooperative organizations like Mr. Dooley started that first milk company up in Ellenburg and so forth, and the milk companies in the St. Lawrence River, you realize that the Dairymen's League reached up into the St. Lawrence River before they reached into this Lake Champlain area. And of course, all along the Mohawk. And so we had eggs. Eggs were your commodity too, and you bought your groceries. That was that was the little bit of money that you had, was what you could raise out of the ground. Now my father raised potatoes, and he would always sell his potatoes in peck sacks out in front of the house, and he retailed his own, because when you put someone when you could raise a product, and you put an individual in the middle, you cut in, that person has a part of your profit. If you can sell your own product, you make a little more. But my father's potato money always paid the taxes. And I can remember that my mother got hurt at one time, and I presume if Dr. Hubert Stiles was here, Hubert Stiles, who lived in that nice white house up in West Shazy, but was from the Turnpike, and became a doctor at the time of the First World War. If Hubert Stiles were alive, he would tell you that many people paid their bills with the produce they had from the farms, and they were very glad to get it. I know the Bill Ledoux family in Plattsburgh, and they look back on it as they barely got $1 for a call and so forth. And I heard someone telling the other night that Dr. Betty Collins and Dr. Bill Ledoux Sr. went to a baby case, and this was the second child that was being born, but he hadn't been paid for the first one, okay? I mean, it was real. There was very little currency, very little currency. And so Francis Shields came to my house. The Shieldses had a big family, and Toddy had been ill, and he had to have salt-free butter. And so my mother always made some butter for Toddy that was salt-free, and they would buy about 13 pounds of butter. And in those days, men wore high cuts and sheepskin jackets and so forth. And he would come to my house to buy butter, and I thought he looked pretty good. He did.
That was Francis.
That was Francis.
And he's the one, you are Mrs. Francis.
Right, and then when my mother died the third year I taught school, and my husband said to me, now look, it's either me or that school, okay? And I chose him. And we had a very wonderful life because we raised turkeys. Now at that time though, Grandpa Shields was afraid that the farm couldn't support 2 families. So he did go to Florida on his assessment check, which was only about $300, and he wrote from Florida. He said to Francis, you go down to Mooney's and you buy yourself some hen turkeys, and you go over to Baker's. I think it was to Baker's, and buy the toms so that they wouldn't be of the same breed and relationship. And then the war, and so he did that because he was afraid the farm couldn't support 2 families. And then the war came on. I remember Charlie Miller coming out to the house. You know, meat was very scarce. And Charlie Miller, okay, so grandfather killed him this turkey, and we picked it for him, and then he dressed it. And I thought, golly, I cleaned up after the affair. You know, I thought there must be an easier, more efficient way than that. So then we got into a packing house and so forth, and we had turkeys for about 22 years, I think. It was Shields Turkey Farm. And then Boy died, and it was then that I realized, because we always worked together, and I realized I had half a head because you had nobody to ask, you know, because it's you don't realize widows. It's a tough one when you don't have.
So did you live on his farm or your father's
his farm?
On his farm. And where was that?
Well, that's west of Beekmantown Corners.
West.
West,
okay.
yes.
All right. We'll take another short break and come right back. We're moving up into the point where this lady wrote a book, and we're going to find out about that as we go along. Thanks much.
Yes. Well, now look.
Somewhere along the way, Addie, you became the county historian. What year?
In '78. And actually, you see, this was through, they had asked a gentleman to leave, and Flora Mayette nominated me, and she called me and said, you have a job. And Flora Mayette was the buyer for Merkel's, and I think she recognized the fact that I may have had a little sales resistance and so forth. And so I went. He says, you've got to go see Francis Broderick. Francis Broderick, and he and I were great friends, became great friends. Francis Broderick said, you only got to come 1 hour a day. And I said, and I had thought, now, do I dare? I'd have to be very careful because this is going to be an interview. But I did manage to say to him, well, Francis, you can't take a car and go anywhere for just an hour a day. And at that time, gasoline was 53 cents. And I went down there, and the files were on the floor. And by April, I guess, we had a quarterly report. And I'd written 190 letters, all the letters that had backed up and so forth. And I thought, heavens, I think the salary was about $3,500, and I figured that out relative to the time. I'd pretty earned a year's labor for $35 a week. And so I went to Jim Sears, who was the chairman of the Board of Legislature, and I said to Jim Sears, look, this is the situation. I've done this much, you know, the salary on this. He said, look, woman, you took this job, you work it. And so I did, of course. And they became a actually, anything is what you put in it. And it became, in the depth of it, it became a 7-day-a-week job because the county historian is responsible for leadership of the town and village historians.
So actually then, maybe I'm ahead of myself.
This came before.
The book,
Came before.
I go to the library quite a bit. I'm very partial to libraries, and in Champlain, New York, I came across in the local section a book called Beekmantown. So I brought it home, and I'm looking through it, and there's various pictures, and I'm looking at it, and then I looked to the side, and it said edited by Addie Shields. Mm-hmm. Well, in 1988, when Peg Barcombe put together that great Rouse reunion in Rouse's Point, and she got me involved in it around that time, that's when I first met Addie Shields to know who she was and to really talk. So I recognized her name here in the early 90s, and I wrote her a note asking if this is still available and could I buy a copy. And this is my copy. And she said, no, it's not for sale to you. And she gave me a copy to Bob Venn and Addie Shields, 51094, as a matter of fact. And it's a very good book. And my question would be, how did this come about, Addie?
Well, first, of course, now he does have Phil White's Beekmantown. And when my husband died in '64, the first person who came to our front door about the second week after Boy's funeral was Phil White. And Phil White had a manuscript.
Just hold this up here.
Phil White was doing this manuscript. And you ask yourself, Mr. Vinn said to me, how did Phil White get in this?
Yeah.
Well, Phil White was going to New York University, and any students that are interested in not having to pay for their own credits, you always watch, in the present day, you watch the bulletin board for what's available. And the Beekmans, Beekmantown, you see, the Beekman family first had down in Poughkeepsie, they had the Beekman patent down there, and they made a lot of money with that in selling it. And as time went on, when the French were defeated up here and all of these French seigneuries became illegal because this was now British territory, the Beekmans had strength enough in the colonial New York legislature that they pulled the string to get what is now Beekman patent. And they got this in 1769 following the rescinding of all these French seigneuries. Now, however, the war intervened, and this was too far away. They couldn't monitor it. And so, to a great extent, the timber was cut off here because a great deal of what the Beekmans hired were people to come up here and check on it, and they would come in where timber had been taken off and so forth. And so the Beekmans were a very long time in selling all of this because of its distance away. Now, in the meantime, they were mercantile people that came with Peter Stuyvesant, and they had that Hotel Beekman and so forth. They developed that, and I visualize that. So they had all these papers from Mr. Kelly that functioned for them, and different people that they were asking to do things. And even I became aware of all of this because I was always a stamp collector. And Mother Shields said to me, well, Addie, when Grandma Shields died, the contents of her top drawer we put on the rafters up in the attic, and I went up there and got those for the stamps, but I was more interested in the letters because the Shieldses, Frank Shields, had functioned for the Beekmans and had cut hay and shipped hay, because you see when New York City people were transported around by horses in liveries, they needed the hay that was raised here, and it was put on the railroad and sent down to them. And so the Shields family and the Reeds up there cut hay, and one of the last plots is that piece of land where the last piece of land that the Beekmans sold here was about, it took them until almost the turn of the century in the 1900s to sell because they were so far away from it. And what really happened, all they got was the cost of the hay off it, but they had to, well, okay. Now, all of that made a lot of paperwork, the archives in the vault in that. And what I visualized that happened with Phil White was that at one time, about the time he was going to school, which would have been about in the 60s, somebody tripping their foot and being tired of this, of having those boxes, and so what are they in the vault, and let's get rid of them. They gave this material to the New York State Historical Society, and in order to get somebody to work with it, the New York State Historical Society added some money to it. And Phil White took advantage of this and said, oh, I looked through those, yes. And so this book is the result of his ferreting out what really happened, what those papers were about. And not only this, before he did this, he did the Beekman family, and I think there's 6 volumes of this. Now, when it came to this, so he came to the door. And because I had the old Presbyterian records, and at that time I had the county home records. I was using them because Greta Howes owned those from Ralph Howe, who had them. And so then he came back the second year, and he brought his family, and they stayed at my house about a month. And he used my materials and worked around here and worked in the county clerk's office. But what you see in this is that this was scholarship material. Now, when he did the manuscript, and I have an original copy of the manuscript, it was too much. Nobody would print it. He offered it to Syracuse University Press and Harvard, and I believe Austin. This is out of Austin. He was signed on as a faculty individual in University of Texas in Austin, and they printed this, but there's a great deal that's left out and that's consolidated from the original. Okay, so much for that. Well, then the bicentennial came along, and I had been away, and Alice Bubbins called me, and Alice was a delight in our town and always an instigator, and they were having a 76, and would I work with this? And then Jim Sears called me, and she said, and they need somebody to speak. Well, so I refreshed my memory, and I got the talk, which was done in the town hall on a Sunday afternoon. I got that over with, and then I got into what a book should be, because of course Hurd did a great deal of the first part of Beekman Town, and so had Phil White. So my first effort was to consolidate what Phil White had in there, and the first chapter in this is that consolidation. And then also Dr. Kellogg had interviewed people. He had interviewed the Dominies and Nathaniel Chittenden Culver and so forth. But all right, but what Alice Bubbins never told me was that they had a cutoff date and a contract with the. She did not explain to me the contract that they had to have that in 6 weeks' time. So that book was done in 6 weeks. However, and all right, I did label this, and this was Ruth Ashline typed it and so forth, and. I was most disappointed when it came through without the labels, and I have since added this errata to it. However, I will tell you that of the bicentennial books, the librarians and those people who recognize archival materials and recognize whether there's errata in them, whether they're correct, this one has stood with time in that it tells a very good correct chronological story of what happened relative to Beekman Town down through to the present. And when Phil White left me, I remember I was a farm gal at that time. I was painting the chopper boxes because we had built them, and it was before you really bought tailored ones from Sarto Giroux or Mr. Dragoon up there. And he came to me and he said, remember that there are no authors amongst the slaves. He said that to me so long ago. I think that's not exactly the last time I saw him, but that was when I was farming.
Okay, we'll take another short break and come back and find out some of the content of the story of Beekman Town, New York. It's written and named after the Beekmans.
Mm.
Now, in here, it shows you as editor. Now, does that mean that some of these were submitted by somebody else and you go over them? Or
Danny Noonan was always the historian. Danny Noonan was the assessor, and Danny Noonan does have an article. He'd been asked to do that, But then that was what he wanted to do, and there was much more. Now, Danny was Irish, and his people had come down to the Richelieu. You know, they'd landed up there in Montreal and kind of been dumped off. You do realize that, that people became the manifest. And, all right. And so Danny's article was the first one that Ruth worked on, and then... You know,
this is the stone house on the Route 22 where
belongs to Larry and Bevy Gagne.
Okay, that's the house now. Okay.
Okay.
And then you said,
incidentally, that was built by Henry Dominy, and it was built. It's not on the 1798 census, but by the War of 1812. By 1812. Apparently this was here in that Wellington had his breakfast down there. Wellington, who was leading the troops, the British southward, actually in 1814, on June 6th of, September 6th, the night of the 5th, and then they marched on in the morning of the 6th. And if you look underneath the maples, you look straight up to the northwest, you can see that high rise in back of Bill Scribner's, and then beyond that, that high rise goes on over into the Amos Barber property and over into what is Sessoms now, but Levi Atwood's. And
well, how does a person do something like this in 6 weeks?
Okay. Well, I know what you mean. Now, Ruth was very good to type, but I knew where things were. Now, this is the picture of Rand Hill and Murtaugh Hill, and that's one of the last things John Ray did. And John Ray and Bill Ledoux, Bill Ledoux's father, William Ledoux Sr., went off to school together. They went to normal school, and one of the things that we knew about them, their mothers made their suits when they went off, and they were a little bit, this bothered them just a bit because they weren't tailor-made, they were handmade. Lottie Ray made John's, and Bill Ledoux's mother did his. And that is a very nice picture in that it shows the elevation. Do you realize that right now some of the best areas in our town of Beekmantown is not exactly always just the lake shore. There's a new development up there in Rand Hill, and our town of Beekmantown has the tallest part, the highest elevation of Rand Hill, and that's where the Bissell Tower is. And then all of those houses, as you're up there, you have the vista. You can see that fine, thin line of the Richelieu River and all of the lake laid out before you. And you know they have wonderful stones for stone walls up there, and they have little depressions, and people have their own swimming pools, just natural little ponds. Because we in Beekmantown own the highest elevation. Okay, this Beekman patent ran from low water mark in Point of Rush straight back north, and at that time it did include Dannemora. And this picture does show, now John Ray was smart enough to realize that is the Duquette Road, and it is the road in the center of the town that looks to the west, and it looks to the highest elevation, which, now this is the road up Rand Hill, and this is Murtaugh Hill, and right there on the top is where the beacon is.
Is that road, 99 Road or something?
The 90, and then...
The 90 Road?
Yes, and then the Agnew Road is just under it. Right. But it's suburbia, actually. It's a great area of our...
The lady who talks with us at Kent Dillard House, Susie is from that 90 Road.
Probably.
She lives up in that hill. So 6 weeks.
Okay, all right. In the meantime, of course, I have always done genealogy, and my grandparents before me, and my father, and I knew who lived everywhere. But so the first thing was this challenge that Phil White had done, because he had the part of the Beekmans and their hotel and the storage they had there, and that brought it up to about 1850. And I think the first person I went to was to George Haylett and to explain the lake, because I really didn't know that much about the lake. And it is George Haylett who remarked that Islamont leans in and Beekmantown thrusts out, and the route is on our side. The route isn't on the Vermont side. Now, I have tried to have the Chamber of Commerce come forth with, we have the north-south route. We have the military highway of warfare from Quebec. And this highway is really what sections off the New England states, and Great Britain knew this, almost the New England states are almost an island in this this waterway, connecting it with Lake George and Hudson River, almost makes that an island. And that was their effort in coming down here constantly to divide this area, to divide what were the Yankees from the Yorkers. And all right, and then of course I had all that background. John Ray was my cousin and I worked with him, and at the time that the John Ray house, John Ray had died at 45, and Dr. J. Lawrence Evans, when they had the auction, J. Lawrence Evans brought me many of, I think he bought me 9 Bibles, and of course I grew up seeing what John Ray had done. And of course, this bit of the house, John Ray was a historian in his way, in that what he did, he went in the summertime, he would go with his camera, and he showed me how to find good composition with a little square, set it up there and look. And get your composition correct. And then when he had these photographs in the winter time, he would sit down and he did a great deal just with pencil, because John Ray didn't have a lot of money to work with. He is the individual who did the statues that are up in Chazy, Adonis and Mercury, that are up in the
at the school?
in a swimming pool in Chazy.
Oh, yeah?
And this was his grandmother and grandfather. This is my great-grandmother's brother, John Dawson, and Elvira Pierce. And he brought me those. He brought me those along with the 9 Bibles. And John Ray, in his house, he drew all of he would take pictures of all the old houses in Beekmantown, and then in the winter time he would do them with a pencil etching, and he would sell them. Now, the only people in John Ray's time that had any money to buy were Molly Wild, and she had 2 other people that lived with her, and they lived in the old original Ray house. And as you come up Route 22, when you leave the Greta House Drive, and you're going up to where you buy ice cream, the Tasty Freeze, John Ray planted those cedars for him. He had to have money to live too. And John Ray, of course, worked down there for Mrs. Wilson in what you speak of as the Sibley place, which is now, Sibley was Walter Crockett Sibley, who was a Pennsylvania legislator, and he came up here and bought what is now Valcour Lodge, and built that boathouse, and bought himself a Lozier boat, because he was coming up here in 1900 buying that from Lewis. And the Lozier, they were just building the Lozier boat along with the Lozier car there in what is now Georgia Pacific, and building the boathouse. And then he died, and his daughter, Mrs. Wilson, and I have John Ray's diaries whereby John Ray went down to, every year Mrs. Wilson paid him to go down there, and he planted those cedars those are John Ray cedars there also at Valcour, where the college owns the Valcour Educational Center. And he had a cutting garden for her and a vegetable garden, and she paid him, and he took 2 men. And then I have in his diary the letters and so forth, whereby when the Depression came, she couldn't afford to come up here. And that cut into his income too. But in any time you have to have, when you spend 5 cents, you've got to have another one. You've got to replace it. You've got to find where to get money. And our economy was that slow. She was the rich individual who hired him because he was also a gardener. And also his effort. When he graduated from normal school, and then he went to Cornell and graduated from there in 1909, he went down to Orange. This is John Ray. And he went down to Orange, New Jersey, and taught. And then he took art courses, and his father died, and he came home. And he tried to use his talents so that he would embellish that wonderful brick house, which has since been torn down where the school is. And he produced an English setting around that house and an English garden, and he hybridized peonies, and he worked with George Hudson. George Hudson was interested in the hybridizing of iris and so forth, and John sought out fine people. And all right, so I had his materials, and I knew Mary Sanger up on the hill, and I knew the procedure really, and it just rolled together. I also knew Greta House, Rita's people and my people were very close. And it just, look, I just did nothing but this.
I can see that.
Please. And then I asked, because we had so much to type, I asked permission from Alan Everest, who had worked with Dr. Kellogg's materials, and we pulled the staples out of my book because the print is different there. You see the documentation. In any book, when you look at it, the print, the size of the print denotes what you got there, whether you've got the documentation establishment as to where you got it. And this, all right, so that we did the Henry Dominy and the Chittenden Culver, and then we had, well, see, this is one of John Ray's pictures of the mill, and you can hear the iambic pentameter. The old shop dozes in the summer sun. You see it? And there's the old shop, and it just rolled together, but almost too quickly. The printer kind of hurt us in that all those pictures were labeled, and they did not. Now maybe that was my fault in that I didn't know how to please them, but I had all of those labeled.
You've got to remember, when you talk about Ray, it's R-E-A.
That's right.
And an article in the paper recently about that, it's not R-A-Y, it's R-E-A.
And you see what the Rays had is when you go to Calvin Brumley's in Route 22, when the British came down there, they couldn't ford that stream in 1814, and so they went right down parallel with the Spellman Road and then hit the Ashley Road and went into East Beekman Town. There's a small bridge there at Ray Dominy's, and they forded that and went on their way. But what I wanted to bring out was that that brook, which starts, one fork of it starts up in back of the Dominy house and comes down and joins, there's another fork that starts up in back of, well, in the Jersey Swamp. And it crosses two fault lines. One of them is there at Calvin Brumley's, and the other one is down at the Ray Foundry, and that's where the glaciated rocks at the mouth of the mill stream are. And you see, he also gave me this picture, and my Charlotte has this. And when you work with the glaciated rocks at the mouth of the mill stream, and that's the second bridge down there by Ray Dominy's, and what you notice about that is that when you work in the archives with Dr. Kellogg's materials, John Ray's grandfather, the original John Ray, was luxuriating with his age at the time, that so was Dr. Kellogg, and Dr. Kellogg came up there. He wrote to Dr. Kellogg, and he came up, and Dr. Kellogg came up there to see the glaciated rocks in the mouth of the mill stream, because Dr. Kellogg was interested in the geology of the place, and it is Dr. Kellogg, you know, who went up to the mouth of the Chazy River, and there they picked up several bushel baskets of, quite a quantity. Now, I'm sorry, I don't mean to, but I have an impression it was quite a quantity, and it may have been, he picked up a bushel of Indian arrowheads and so forth, where the current had washed the sand away from around them, and they stood up there in little pinnacles. We don't have an opportunity like that, do we?
No, we'll take another short break and come back. We're talking with Addie Shields, and we're at Point of Rush.
You know, I absolutely...
One of the things that I noticed in going through this book was this Clifford LaPlante, 1893-1976. And there was a picture of a truck, and it's a meat van where he sold meat. House to house, right? Clifford LaPlante, Kent LaPlante's dad. All right, and tell us a little bit more about Clifford.
Well, of course, the LaPlantes lived up west on the LaPlante Road, and Clifford LaPlante. One of the things now, what you got to see in that is that Clifford LaPlante was very outgoing. He was everybody's friend. He was a happy individual, and apparently he could sell. And you know, it's here too. Owen Henry and Frank Holland were meat peddlers also, and Henry Holland said he made more money with his butcher knife than he could cutting wood with an axe. That's merchandising. Now, Clifford LaPlante told me that. One of the things that he was always your friend, and you see, he was everyone's friend. He was in the bank and so forth. But I grew up with his nieces. I grew up with Walter's kids, and I also knew his other brother who was a forest ranger. And So he was a friend of mine. One of the things I felt badly about was, though Ken told me that when he was ill, one of the last things his father talked about, he had asked, and apparently I didn't have a phone down here, and he didn't know where I was. He was over in the Mary Fletcher. He wanted to talk to me, and I am sure he had some more tremendously important things, and it died with him because we couldn't make the connection. But I did see him for this much, and up there in, after this, I also did underground slavery, and up there in that wonderful house that he bought right there at the terminal, where the train went through there, past near his house, didn't it? Somewhere near, and in that house there was a secret compartment where slavery, individuals who were running away, fugitive slaves, could be hidden and so forth. But he was such a winning person. I liked what he told me here too, that well, you have to have good merchandise to keep the trust and the respect of your neighbors and to continue selling locally. You know, you cheat somebody locally and you're all done because people talk to each other, and he didn't. He had a fine road horse and he bought a new market wagon, and with his steady smile and his good, honest, gregarious personality, he did well. And soon he was driving in a new Model T Ford van. In his travels, he ran into the purchasing power of the members of the encampments of the ROTC in maneuvers along the Saranac and in the fields on Rand Hill, and he enjoyed reflecting how that it was in June when the maneuvers were here, and he must have come home tired and happy and sat down to delicious strawberry shortcakes. And Clifford, enjoying making people happy, soon under the supervision of his good mother, strawberry shortcakes were made in great pans, and he carried these to the boys in the maneuvers, serving out the delectable dish into their mess kits and topping each with a bountiful scoop of sugared whipped cream. Imagine that, men that were all hot and tired, that had been being pushed around by a buck sergeant and so forth. The soldiers were so pleased, and the demand for this tasty dish was so great that not only his 4 sisters, Mercy, Marthy, Mary, and Nina, but his neighbors, the Giles girls, as well, were picking and hulling the wild strawberries for the wonderful money that he was returning to them. And later on, in the family get-togethers, the sisters would kid Clifford about his wonderful engineering ability when they engineered them into, he maneuvered them into feeding the whole company, not only the ROs, but Teddy Roosevelt and one of the important Astors as well. You must forgive me, but I like that too. Yeah. I like Clifford.
You know, I was up to his home on the LaPlante Road talking to Betty and Walter.
Oh, yes.
And they have a picture. Do you ever see a picture of his mother? A painting?
Yes.
It's a gorgeous, she was a gorgeous young girl. Yeah. All right, well, what we want to do is just very quickly go through your litany here in the front, the chronological table, and the history of Beekmantown.
Well, okay, now it is the same as the entire North Country. It starts with Jacques Cartier and Champlain, and I do want you to know that for Isle of Mont. Now, in the area that you're showing, and it's too bad that he can't maneuver and get the pictures out the windows. When I worked with Champlain's journals, and when Champlain came down, he thought he was still in the river. He said they passed 2 islands, and then they came to this sand beach. You know, Indians never got out in the mud. Indians knew enough to park a canoe where they weren't getting all mud. So they were at St. Anne's, and there they hunted and fished. And then they entered the river again, and they passed this. They went past about 3 leagues of this island, and then on this same island, they stopped and spent the night. And in the morning, they entered the river again, and there, going just a short distance, they entered the start of the lake, and there they could see the mountains. And what this means is that Champlain had made a mistake. Champlain thought that Monty's Bay was a river and that the lake started here and not up there in Ross's Point. Now, children like that because children like to enjoy the fact that not only kids make mistakes, but Champlain made one too. All right, and then what this amounts to, this whole chronology, is that there's an ironstone bay over there, which is Fitch's Bay, which is the Fisk Bay, and it's a limestone bay. And the Indians, of course, burned lime also. They knew about that, and the French did, and so did the British. And you know, after the Revolution, you can just see that this wonderful lake, which is now a rich man's paradise, that at that time this lake was a workman's lake, and they had those old batons, and the first sale of materials went out of that quarry that's right across there, the Fisk Quarry, and the rock from there built the abutments of the Royal Victoria Bridge, the first bridge that was built up there in Canada in 1850. That rock came from Isle of Mont, from this very area near to Beekmantown. Now, before that, so Champlain had come down here, he'd slept all night over there. The other bit is that Benedict Arnold used that bay also, and Prevost's army was here to the side, and the Indians, there are people along the front of this area, the bay that looks to the north, Montes Bay, that have found a little fine shot, and you take that shot and you go down to the Historical Society and you realize that some of that is from a French bore, because anyone who knows armaments knows that they changed the bore and they made their own balls and so forth, and with metal detectors they have found shot. We have a friend who has three of them that are in just an ashtray and they look at them, but it ties them in. All right, now the Beekmans, though, when the Beekmans came with Peter Stuyvesant, then they bought that land down in Beekman, down at Poughkeepsie in Dutchess County, and then when all of the French, this land was granted, now the French were down in here through the French and Indian War because that was strategic, and they built Isle of Mont, or they built St. Anne's at Isle of Mont. But the other thing, in 1758, the French surveyors placed Montmarcy on a map incorrectly and figured its height. And then, of course, what we don't realize is what really happened when, at Quebec, the French were defeated and the British took over. And even some of the problems that the Quebecos have today are very justified, because it hasn't always been absolutely correct if you study the legislature, the parliamentarians with the Anglophones having the better side of things and the Francophones being somewhat defeated. It's been difficult.
Let me just give some dates here. Like 1759, the French army retreated to Canada from Ticonderoga. 1760, a battle at Point of Fur out there and just off Rouse's Point. Major Rogers with 250 British victorious over 350 French. Charles D. Friedenberg settles the mouth of the Saranac,
which is Plattsburgh.
1763, we're talking 230 years ago. End of the French and Indian War, like you were talking. Champlain Valley to the British, except La Framboise.
Yes, see, La Framboise stayed up there, and that's where your little French cemetery is in Frenchman's Bay.
All right, now here's where we get into Beekman. 1768, Beekman's petitioned for a grant and hire Peter Turner. That's for here. In 1769, the Beekmans granted 30,000 acres. I can't even imagine how big 30,000 acres.
That's from here all the way back to Dannemora, and Dannemora was taken off in 1754. Wait a minute here, yes, 17? No.
I think that's
1854, and the first census that was taken in the town of Dannemora, you have to read the town of Beekmantown in 1850, because Dannemora was taken off in 1854.
Okay. So the whole town was that 30,000 acres?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Montes Bay, south, including Treadwell's Bay. Charlotte County, taken from Albany County, including both shores of Lake Champlain in 1772. 1773, this you've heard about, the Boston Tea Party, just mentioning that to get you a time frame. And then in 1775, the capture of Skenesboro. Now, Skenesboro is no longer in existence by that name, but it's Willsboro? Ticonderoga.
Skenesboro is Whitehall.
Whitehall.
What I want to inflect in there is at the time of the Boston Tea Party in 1774, you got the Quebec Act, and Great Britain's Parliament was playing politics with the priests, with Canada, with the French government, with the Canadian government. Wait a minute here. The very fact that Great Britain owned that now, and she wanted the seigneuries to stay with them, and so she made the Roman Catholic Church legal up there in the Quebec Act of 1774, which followed the Boston Tea Party. And at that time, you know, you study and you learn things as you go, but I didn't have that. The Quebec Act belongs in there, following the Boston Tea Party. And then you see, when you read the historical signs that that Benjamin Franklin and the two Carrolls, and one of the Charles Carroll and his brother, who was the bishop of down in Maryland, when they came up through to get the seigneurs to go with them and to get Canada, which to revolt against Great Britain too, the Canadian people objected to this, and they did not go with Benjamin Franklin. You do realize that in this Roman Catholic bit, you realize the story of Lord Baltimore in Maryland and the quarrels that they had down there, and then the Catholic people going into Pennsylvania, and when so that the Roman Catholic religion was respected in Pennsylvania because that's the land of brotherly love, and it was also respected up here in Quebec. And the 1774 made it, even though that was British territory, and you remember that King Henry VIII and how they beheaded people in religion, you had to be the way the king wanted you to think religious-wise, so that it was a very touchy subject. And in Rhode Island, it is documented that Roman Catholic priests in Rhode Island were thrown in the slammer. And it takes to the end of the Revolution, and you think of wars. Wars broaden people. People get out and see different things. And at the end of the American Revolutionary War, that is the time in 1774, the Quebec Act, when Parliament gave the French people up here in Canada, in Quebec, made their church legal, that following the Revolution, that then it took time for the French people to come down here and so forth. But with the American Revolution, Roman Catholicism became legal in the United States of America also.
Okay. Declaration of Independence, 1776. Arnold's defeat at Valcourt. Loss of the Royal Savage. That was a boat. That's what the Royal Savage restaurant is named after, right across in that bay. In 1777, Burgoyne's invasion up the lake and surrender at Saratoga. Moses Hazen, Commander-in-Chief of Continental Troops, Albany, 300 Vermont volunteers. Now, that was in this area, too?
All right, because in that 1777 business in Vermont, one of the things that you want to realize, that Canada played, the British Parliament played politics. They really could not accept the fact that these 13 colonies had rebelled and had won against them. They could not believe that. And Ira and Ethan Allen were over there in Vermont. And this area, the state of Vermont, if you think about the state of Vermont, and you can see the northern part of it from Alberg, when you approach Isle-la-Mont, and where St. Anne's is the the most northwesterly point of Vermont is St. Anne's, the shrine. And that's a wedge, that part of Vermont, which bordered all of this military highway, was a wedge way down into these colonies that were rebelling. And that is why they played politics with Ethan Allen, and it is said that Ethan Allen had two strings in his bow. One of them was to get Great Britain out of the colonies, but also to make his land legal, because his land was not accepted by the United States government until 1791 because of the fracas that Ethan Allen had. The colonists knew that he was kind of too, he was on the edge of things. He was trying to see how much he could get from Quebec or how much he could get from us. But we don't realize that was the Great Wilderness, that area to the east of us over there. Think of the young men who fought all the way up to Montreal and fought all the way up to Quebec. And when they were disbanded, there were no airplanes to take them home. They walked through this great wilderness, and therefore they knew it very well. And they could subsist on, they followed the rivers back, and the center of population, if you look at that, at Burlington, and the center of population was to the southeast along the Atlantic coast, so that Vermont was a great wedge, and it was beside us, but very important. And right now, when we live here, you realize that, so their government started in 1777, and one of the first things they did was start their their college. Ethan Allen, at the end of his life, even though he had lost all his money and so forth, he pulled the string with the legislature to establish the University of Vermont. He didn't have a lot of money to give to it, but he got it put over there in Burlington. And then our first papers, our first printings out of this whole area are printed out of Rutland newspapers. And the ones that are in the Kent Dillard House are copies from the Rutland newspapers, the 1798 census of this area, and which are copies from that Rutland newspaper, because we didn't have one in 1798.
Okay, we'll take another short break, come back, and we'll continue on to the modern part of Beekmantown.
You know, the other thing. Well, when you stop and think about where lands came from, too, how did all these lands get started? All right, and so, of course, the kings granted land. And then in order to get here, you had the people that owned the ships. And as time went on, when they made well, you know, sure, they lost some of their ships, but a ship owner always came through with. And he had a little bit more. He could import things, and his house was a little better, and his furnishings were better, and they had French silvers and the best lace and so forth, and brocades. And when it came, you know, there weren't the banks at that time. Land was your investment, and everyone was using either the Spanish doubloon, but mostly the British pound sterling, because of Spain's demise, the doubloon didn't have much in back of it. But the ship owner became the speculator, and so he would pull strings and get lands. And a part of the problem with the New Hampshire grants between the Yankees and New Yorkers were the ship owners became the speculators. Now Burlington, really, Ira Allen has a diary in which, from a ship owner, when the lands were depreciated, because the Duke of York, Cadwalader Colden, who was the governor of the colony, had said, look, the border is over there. We own all the way to Connecticut River. That meant that the New Hampshire people who owned this land that had been sold to them by the speculator, the land was good for nothing. But Ethan Allen and Ira were smart enough to pick some of that up, because Ira was a surveyor, and he surveyed Mount Mansfield. His rectangular land was what? And he came in 1773, he came out of there, and he said, his diary said, I couldn't find one place for a good farm in there. Well, of course not. We know it's Mount Mansfield. Well, he'd spent 90 pounds for that. So he went back to Salisbury, Connecticut. And there in a tavern, he found somebody owned some land right next to it. And, well, he had a great time, you know. So they drank a little grog, and they talked about this land, and he owned right next to that man, and he sold him all of his Mount Mansfield and got his 90 pounds back. And then he and Heman came back up here, and it was his desire that they'd better buy at the mouth of that Winooski River. And so in the spring, they came back, and he built a road. And see, that's why Burlington is so important, because when the first Jeffrey Amherst at the Crown Point time had built a road over to Bennington, and he builds another one from up to Colchester, from Castleton to Colchester, which gave anybody who was up in Burlington an avenue back out and also an avenue to settle by. And then they got up here, and they discovered that that land right along the lake, the very best part of it, belonged to a man by the name of Burling, and that he was a merchant down in White Plains, and so he got himself down there. He and Heman, Ira and Ethan and Heman, dressed all up as if they were British soldiers, British officers, and they went down there, and they had money that they needed to invest, and so they bought Burlington Bay from this man who had bought from a speculator. Do you see? And then they came up here and started that little trading post and so forth, and then it became his problem to get Great Britain out of it, and to also to make his land legal, because it was contested. And the reason it was contested, in 1664, when King George gave to, and I'm not sure whether it's King George or not, gave to the Duke of York for what was the colony of New York, he gave him everything from the Connecticut River over to the Jersey River, over to New Jersey, the Delaware River, okay? And, all right, then as time went on, the little colony of Connecticut grew, and they made an agreement with Connecticut. So on this side, on the west side of the Connecticut River, over to within 20 miles of the Hudson River. And so as time went on, people thought they would keep that 20 miles up. And you know, as you've been a kid in school and you drew it was easy to draw New York State. It was a challenge. Straight line up there, put the river, you follow, put the St. Lawrence in on, Lake Ontario and Lake Erie, and then a straight line with Pennsylvania and a little slant here. And this went straight up. We never asked ourselves why. But that was because they made an agreement with Connecticut. And then they continued to go up there. But at first, you see, at first, it was way over to the Connecticut River. So when Bennington Wentworth gave all these grants to New Hampshire, that gave quite a problem, because Bennington Wentworth, when he sold it way over to Lake Champlain, and New York figured they owned it over to the Connecticut River. Now, no one talks about the Connecticut River, but do you realize how important that was in the development of, in the settlement of, in the farmers settling and having something to sell, which went down the Connecticut River to Hartford. And that Hartford Courant, C-O-U-R-A-N-T, was one of the first newspapers down there. And okay, and so in these speculators not knowing what they were doing, because you know they lived out here on the seacoast, and whoops, the western business was just a question mark. It was a surveyor's line going west. And when they got to the Connecticut and Massachusetts had a problem. They both owned the same land, and so Massachusetts gave them what is now the bottom of Vermont, and they called it equivalent lands, and that's the land of Deerfield and so forth, the story of the French and Indian.
Okay.
I gotta have some water.
Okay. Well, then we'll get into, in 1781, defeat Cornwallis by Washington. In 1783, the independence of the colonists recognized by the British. Benjamin Moores, M-O-O-R-E-S, and a party of 10 erected a log house at Point of Rush.
All right, and that's there's a Hazen patent down here, and I can't describe it. You came past it. I can't describe it to you. And see, Moses Hazen had taken Allen Everest's book, in which he made a study of Moses Hazen and Congress's own regiment. Moses Hazen had worked for the French, for the British when they came down here and cut timber, and because the British boats, they were wooden. They were all wooden bottoms, and they needed masts. And you do realize that the mast for a boat, it's a tall business, 90 foot or so, and we had a lot of very good timber. All right. As time went on, in that little period of time from when we were rebelling against Great Britain, and Great Britain wasn't trusting Moses Hazen, there was that period of time when things weren't quite right, and so Moses Hazen fell in with the United States government and brought these Canadian woodchoppers with him down through and served for the United States government. Those are the individuals who, when you function with the books in Canada, the church records, you will find written in, especially at Chambly and over at Addie, you will find absent with the rebels, because these French people, the woodchoppers, who had gone south with Moses Hazen and officiated and were part of the defeat of Cornwallis in 1781, and then it took them a long time to get back home, and the government had promised them stuff, had promised them their wages for working, and then we didn't have much of a government, and we didn't have any money anyhow, and very slowly they were taken care of by the priest in, and many of the French people have records in Pennsylvania at St. Joseph's Church in Philadelphia, and those priests went down into where Cornwallis at Yorktown, that went down into Yorktown, and so the records of many of the French are there in St. Joseph's Parish. And then as they went up, they got as far as Newburgh, and there they wintered at Newburgh, and then they come up here, and not until 1786, when our new government in 1786 established the land office, one of the first things they did was to establish the Canadian and Nova Scotian refugee tract to take care of the rebels who could not go north. The rebels could not go north, and up there at Point of Fur, which means point of fire, because they always kept a little fire as a beacon there, and the Kings Bay, and the people there, you know, the French people knew how, in those days, you know, you didn't have a store, they knew how to winter, but the soldiers that were there at Point of Fur came in and touched a match to their hay that they saved for their animals and so forth, and made them quite miserable for quite a time, and they didn't own anything. And once they did get, okay, so, and they couldn't go north, they could not go north because they were rebels, and when they were given land, now you look at, okay, so Platt had been very busy, and you look at the patent map, Platt took care of himself. The Beekmans had this strip, and then there's a little plot just north of us here in Beekman Town, and then this Plenty More was up there managing his efforts and so forth, the Smith Graves patent, and south of us, Plenty More, Platt continued to survey, and when it came time in 1786 to issue a patent to the French people, if you will look that, it's the sand plains and the sandy area, and then it circumvents, it's into Scholar Falls and north and past Beekman Town and up into Altona and around, and the best land is that nice plains land, that river bottom land up there in Champlain at Corbeau Creek and so forth. That is the refugee tract. Now those who, now that was given to them according to how much they had served, and they had to pay for half the Savan. Well, you take somebody, so where was he going? Where was someone who had been up here since 1781, and this is 1786, in the last 5 years, what could he have done? I will tell you this too, in that period of time, Great Britain was not happy with this crew of rebels, and so in those first years, she had many ships that needed to be rebuilt, and actually why she was defeated in Yorktown was that her boats needed repairing at that time. And when the French Navy came up, Great Britain was in trouble because her ships needed repairing, and so she took them. She owned New Brunswick, the Nova Scotia, New Brunswick area, and that area, this latitude, is the latitude of the pines, and therefore they were being fixed there. Therefore there wasn't much sale for anything here, and our nice little people from 1781 until 1786 had a hard time up there. And there are letters to document this, saying, you know, that things were tough, the King's soldiers, because Point of Fur remained in Great Britain's territory until in 1795, when Jay, as our first statesman, our first ambassador, got Great Britain to pull those out of there in Fort Niagara and Fort Oswego, so that our Frenchmen in Frenchman's Bay, and who were asking for and who got this land in 1786, really had a hard time. And those that were right next to, that were in the Chazy River Valley, right next to the lake, and in there for probably 5 miles, that was very good. But somebody whose land was a little bit west in Altona, it didn't take them long to see that the glacier had taken all the topsoil off of that and down, and many of those people swapped off that land for a bolt of cloth or a tobacco, or and this is, I'm not sure who records this, I'd have to look at that documentation, but it is documented that they sold their land for a bag of flour, a bolt of cloth, or some tobacco. And Plenty More became very wealthy. The other thing too is that Benjamin Moores, who had functioned with them, who had been to Yorktown with them and back and was their friend and had probably learned to pick up some French, became their French because he could negotiate with them. And when you work with the land deeds downstairs in the clerks, you will find there are whole pages. When Benjamin Moores died, Charlotte was there And there are 28 lines to a page. That was her bank account. That's what she could sell. That was where she got her money, selling that land that he picked up from them.
We'll take a short break and we'll be right back. We're talking with Addie Shields. You should get this book and look it up in one of your libraries if you don't have a copy. Are these still available, by the way?
There are a few left.
A few. How would they get a book like this?
Oh, I'll get you some.
Okay, so, I mean, they would contact you?
Yes.
Addie Shields in the phone book, Point of Rush.
Right. I have to pay the town of Eatontown for them, but I get them so or they can go.
Could, if you want. Now, in here it mentions 1784, Peter Saley first sees the lake area and thought it the most beautiful he had ever seen. 175 years since the discovery by Champlain. And Washington County was established. That was down, down around
That was all of us. All of us.
We were all
from Albany up. Washington County was taken away from Charlotte, and then Clinton County was taken away from Washington County, and that is so that you could record deeds. And then as the towns were done, the vital statistics were given to the towns in 1880. Because 1880 would be horse and buggy days, and vital statistics are deaths and births, and you take an old doctor with a wagon, a horse and a wagon, to record births. He couldn't come from Ellenburg all the way down to Plattsburgh, so you recorded births in a town. You think of that in the division of records, the county, in the county seat, has the wills and the deeds and the mortgages and the probates, the administrations, whereas every little town has its own vital statistics, which are births, deaths, and marriages.
You got to remember, too, if you're looking up records, if you're new at this, that if you're born in a town or died in a town, regardless of where you live, that's where it's going to be recorded. So if you were visiting at Mrs. Shields' house here, and you died here in the house, it would be recorded in the town of Beekmantown, not in the town of Champlain where you live. Correct?
Right.
And this is very hard sometimes if you're on a trip and you died. Likewise, if you're born, you weren't born in the town of Champlain, you were born in Plattsburgh. At the hospital, maybe. So you're not really born in Champlain. So you got to be careful where you look for those records. In 1786, Plenty More settled in Champlain. We know about Plenty More. Now, 1788, Clinton County was established. It included Essex, Franklin, and some of Vermont, they said, right?
Mm-hmm.
And
the islands.
And there were only 3 towns, correct?
That's right.
The town of Champlain, Plattsburgh,
and Willsboro.
Mm-hmm. In 1790 rather, census finds that there are 88 heads of families in Plattsburgh, which included Beekmantown.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
In 1791, Vermont statehood boundary was established at the center of the lake. And even though it's in the center, you said the highway or the boats were on this side.
It takes George Hewlett to say that the route is just a half mile off our shores here, where we come together with Isle-of-Mont.
Must be deeper on this side, obviously, right?
Yes.
In 1796, the British finally withdraw from the lake at Point of Fur. I did not know that they were still down here till 1796.
Oh, yes. Not until John Jay, our first ambassador, went to England, and so Point of Fur, they were withdrawn from Point of Fur, from Oswego, and from Fort Niagara all at the same time.
You had just mentioned that before. I never realized that. In 1799, this is important now, Essex County, as a county, was established, and it was taken from Clinton County.
And the Ausable River is the dividing line.
Ausable. So that
Right.
Keysville is in 2 townships and
right.
2 counties.
That's right.
In 1808, Franklin County was established, and again taken from Clinton.
That's right.
In 1811, the first academy in Plattsburgh was established. What academy would that have been? You
The
mean
Plattsburgh Academy.
Plattsburgh? That's a school.
And that's, yes. And the boys came out of that academy to defend the villagers against the onrush of the British as they came down from across the border and down from Champlain and so forth.
Right. In 1814, McDonough defeats the British at the Battle of Plattsburgh in September 11th. You remember before Addie mentioned September the 5th and the 6th, coming down through Beekmantown. They stayed overnight and ate breakfast on the 6th in that stone house. In 1817, establishment of the Presbyterian Church, 1820 to 1826, built by Allen Armies.
Arms.
Why is this important in here? Because the Presbyterian Church was...
There was the first church. It was the second church. It was the second Presbyterian church in Plattsburgh, because in 1817, Beekmantown, that church, Beekmantown hadn't been erected. Beekmantown wasn't erected until 1820, and it was built by Allen Arms. And Allen Arms was the person who had the first sawmill up there in West Shazy.
Now, you also mentioned before, and when we were off camera, that as big as Beekmantown is, all the way across it, does not have a Catholic church with all the Catholics in the area.
No, because at first it was settled by Protestant people. And remember, I said that the Roman Catholic Church really wasn't, in 1774, the Quebec Act was gave made it legal. And there were in Champlain some of these refugees who dared to stay, but they were up in Champlain. And this part was all settled by people from Long Island and along the Hudson and so forth. And then, as time went on, the French people came down, and you have to look that in 1853 St. Peter's was established, and we're not terribly far from St. Peter's. And this part of Point of Russia thrusts out. There's just a little ways to go up to St. Joseph's in Coopersville, and all these farmers along the lake shore, the Catholic farmers, went to St. Joseph's. The Lucks and
by water,
the Pizettes,
right?
and the
By
Bertrands all went by. And you do realize, too, that water traffic, if the wind was with you and if it was a great day, that was the way to go, because it was less obstruction, especially for the farmers that lived along the lake here.
Mm-hmm. In 1820, Beekmantown, as a town, was established, separated from Plattsburgh by the state legislature.
Yes, all right, and that you find in the legislative session statute records. But the point of it is that they had people enough at that time. The population had grown. And the other bit is that about that time, in 1821, 1822, they were establishing the secondary industries, where at first, our first sawmills, we first cut timber and we hauled it, and it went in rafts north. But by 1822, they had built the Champlain Canal, and it was open for use. But in order to get something through a canal, it had to fit in a canal boat. And that's when, with the Industrial Revolution in the 1820s, then you had this secondary thing that could happen in this area. You not only cut and limbed a tree and got it to the lake to put it in a raft to go north, now you put it into deals, which are 14 by 14 inches, and you also built the canal boats. So that started us on the Industrial Revolution.
You got to remember that the lake, again, one of the oddities of Lake Champlain is it flows north. Very few lakes flow north.
But let me tell you something about its flowing north. It only flows, it takes 3 hours for it to flow 1 mile to the north, because, and you look at that alluvial land over there in Canada, in the settling, at the time of the glaciations and the meltdown, in the settling of, now all of this went to the south at one time, the Lake Ontario and across that Altona business. But as that area in Whitehall rose, is it only a foot higher than it is up there? So it flows very slow. So unless the south wind's blowing, gives you no opposition.
Okay.
Down the lake.
In 1821, the first census in the town finds one fulling mill and one grist mill and 21 asheries. What is a fulling mill? Do you know?
Well, everybody raised sheep at that time. Everybody raised sheep, and sheep, are, you can't tell Mrs. Myers that, of course, but they are greasy. You pat a sheep and your hand is all greased, and so it takes lye. And so the potash business goes with this, in that it takes lye to clean up wool, and then after you weave it, you'll have to have it all hot, and you have to take the gimp out of it in order to press it and have it in the fulling mill. They talk about full cloth, fulled cloth. That's a process whereby it will be nice and flat and workable. Before that, it's a mess.
So the asheries, 21 asheries, is where you get rid of your wood, as they were clearing the wood.
You have to stop and think that when you lop off trees, when you see a stand of trees, very, very seldom do you see a stand of trees that they're always a straight rift. you know,
Yeah.
and all the same. You'll get all right. And so the straight rift ones you can put in a raft. They'll fit together great. And actually they were rafted. You think of over here in the bay, over in that part that's so shallow, that was a great place to put rafts together because you could wade out there in the summertime when the water was warm and so forth and lash those together as you, but then where you cut them from, so the limbs and the whatever went into, and you could leach out and make lye, because now Great Britain in all of her wars with Scotland, in her meanness towards Ireland and to Scotland, she burned a great deal of that territory, and then all those people had were sheep, and you know, a cow won't eat after a sheep because a sheep with their teeth, they'll bite, 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 and they eat everything off, and therefore they didn't raise another crop of timber. They never propagated another crop of timber, and they had to buy from Finland or from Russia, and Great Britain wanted the balance of power, the money always returning to her. And so one of the great products that she would allow us, one of the manufacturings that she would allow us to do was to make potash so that we could give her some potash for her industries. And one of the fallacies of it is that there was a Leblanc who at the time of the Napoleonic Wars discovered the process, the Solvay, I'm not sure whether this is the Solvay process, but whereby you make, you separate for the nitrates and so forth and then with Napoleon, I'm not doing this very well and I apologize, but with the beheadings of all the Napoleonic time, the poor man was discouraged. He could not sell his process and he killed himself. But after all of this war, all of this, Great Britain, the Germans came through with this process of etching glass and what they did with the lye and so forth for cloth, and then we were into that was the end of our asheries, but not until that wonderful process by Leblanc, which Leblanc had killed himself over because he couldn't market it, not until the Germans came through with that, we had a great sale for, and the lye that they would make, the potash that they would make, they'd put it in a hogshead and it would go on top of the rafts and go north because Great Britain would buy it, and it was worth a great deal.
Right. We'll take another short break, and we're up to 1821. Just going to few things here with a couple of short remarks, and we'll be back. Thank you much for watching Hometown Cable. Your program is called What's Going On Here. We're on every Sunday at 12:30, 4:15, 8 p.m., midnight, and 8 the following morning. The same times every day for a show on Hometown Cable with Calvin and Sam bringing you things throughout the area. Please tune in, and if you haven't already, please become a patron in this new 1996. Happy New Year, too. We'll be right back.
Calvin, tell me something.
You know, I wish I had the capacity to remember names the way you rattle them off without even thinking about them. I mean, you just...
Well, I have a hard time.
And of course, yeah, but you got to remember, you know, you mentioned that people realize that we do not prepare anything. You haven't the slightest idea what we're going to talk about.
I'm sure of it.
And as a matter of fact, you said you kind of forgot we were coming this morning. Okay. We're very hometownish here, and we're very pleased that you can talk with us. 1827, 1830, the first county home was built. Now, people may not know what a county home is, some of the younger people. What's a county home?
Well, you have to realize that in 1830 there weren't very many people here. They all pretty much lived in log cabins. There were a few. They were plank houses too, you know, and a great many of our first houses were in bank houses. You take all those houses along Route 22 and you start with where Dr. Palmer's son is, who has the, he sells surge equipment, that's what it is. That house on the west, it's very clearly defined where that the first floor is where they lived, and they lived in these bank houses first, and then they went up to their house. And then as you go along, this is very true, that house of Culver Hill, that was a bank house first too. They utilized the cellar. That was a summer kitchen because it was cool down there and so forth, and it was an area where you had storage, but you took advantage of it. And as you go along up north, that house of that stone house that I showed you, they utilized Jeremiah Jeremiah Dominy came back about in 1873, and he told how that first year they lived in the cellar, and they almost their well was a shallow well, and there wasn't water, and they almost got in trouble not having wood and so forth. But the next year they went up with the second floor and so forth. But they always utilized that first floor, and then the next house is the Scribner house, and that was a bank house too. Those along Route 22. And
what do you refer to when you say bank house? What do you mean?
well, just what I'm telling you, where you've got a little slope, a hill.
Oh, and you just build right into the
You
side.
build right into it, and then you built your upstairs over it, but you got your cellar. You took advantage of the natural cellar.
Was Route 22 developed before Route 9?
Route 22 was first, and do you know why? When you travel, okay,
rivers, I guess.
The water was the first. The waterway was the easiest. We mentioned that. But then as you go north, if you got a horse, you can't have a horse running in a foot of mud. You've got to have footing for anything. And the fault line, when you go north out of Plattsburgh, that quarry road, there's that fault line, and it goes in. It's a Spellman fault, and it goes right up through to Route 22. Then it is Nell Sullivan. All right, now the 1790 road was laid along it, but then they went straight by the school bus garage and went straight up, and the railroad track follows that line until you get to the area which is Ketch's Bridge or the Woodchuck Hill area, and then they slanted over and took, you finish the Spellman fault line there, and you go over to the Ingraham-Esker, because you've got to have a road, you've got to have elevation. Don't you know that even nowadays we've used all our gravel? We first put our stone walls in to get the roads up high enough so the wind would blow the snow across. Otherwise, in the wintertime, when you had stone walls, they would pocket, the snow would pocket in there, and you couldn't move it because it was 4 foot deep.
I don't know how long ago they stopped putting up snow fences. Remember the snow fences?
So that people, when a person would have a mental problem, he'd have a heart condition which would affect the mind, the people had no way of taking care of them. Now, very often, if they're gentle, they take care of them in the house, but somehow or other, the first county home was established in the 1830 time, and you know where they built it? They built it there where the county home across from Harry Bush's, those big buildings. There's an administration building and the men's building and a woman's building, and then Leo Fortin bought and built a house on the high rise there, but there's that very nice laminated barn, but it looks at that big flat that goes to the railroad track because they raised enough produce there to feed those people, and they had their cattle, and so that it did not cost very much other than administration.
It was known as the county home for years, right across from where Bushy's and then the Racine's garage, nearly across those big brick buildings.
Because in backer Bushy's and Racine's garage is you can raise onions on any of that land. That's great garden ground, right straight from there down through the park.
It was like pretty near our first nursing homes, weren't they?
Yes,
they were pretty the same type of.
Yes, and many of the people did according to how much strength they had left.
Yeah. Now, in 1845, the Denimore prison was built, and it was in the town of Beekmantown at that time.
Yeah, but it's up there on the hill.
Yep.
And all right, and so as Denimore developed, Denimore was taken off, I think in 1857, something like this, became the town of...
54 you have in here.
I got 54.
Now remember, that's Denimore town, not village.
Okay.
That's that whole area, big area, not just where the village...
was there.
Yeah, the prison was there then, right.
Because the prison was built in 45, and there were enough people by 54 to set it up as a town. But the point of it is that when you first search for the first people who worked and lived in the town of Denimore, you look at the United States Census that was enumerated in 1850. The other thing that's very important, Louis Robinson, who lived in West Chazy and who owned the Robinson... if you're on the turnpike, that old tavern, Louis was from that old tavern, and when he was a child, when he was a young man, 18, 19 years old, he walked from that tavern over to Denimore to be a guard, crosslots.
You know, there was articles in the paper not long ago about this Robinson's Tavern.
By Mr. Broadwell.
Yes, very
good.
Very
and
well very well known, Robinson's Tavern. I'm not exactly sure exactly where it is either.
Well, you don't. It's up on the turnpike. It's
but turnpike's pretty long.
Well, yes, but as you now the town of Chazy put that marker up there. The Friends of the Library. Louis paid for it because I can remember at the time he did it. I did Louis's genealogy, and he was negotiating with Nell Sullivan and the Friends of the Library, and he paid for it to get that marker up there. And it is the ruins, the old stone ruins that are so picturesque as you go along on the military turnpike, just as you get into the town of Altona, about 1.5 miles or so. And
it's in the town of Altona?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
But of course it was at first in the town of Chazy.
Yeah, now the Louis Robinson ran a business, building materials and so forth, right across from the Wesleyan Church, just east of the Four Corners in Beekman Town. And I guess, did he have any children?
No,
he left money to some...
Louis went to school down in Pulteney, and he met Rui, his wife Rui. And all right, Louis was very astute, and he not only he recognized the Canadian dollar, and he bought Canadian things. When we bought bricks or you bought tin from Louis, you were buying a product that was out of Canada. He also had the franchise for all the sugar and all the flour that went into Bouillies right up to the time of his death.
Is that right?
Yes.
Now, I understand that his building across from the church used to be the old church.
Oh, yes.
And then he bought it, and then they built the new church, and then he added on to his building. He had a very good, big business there, and it was a very... I've forgotten where his money was donated. He donated money to the
well, Louis would feel very badly relative to how his money is being handled, because he really wanted, right beside him was Victor A. Wood's wonderful house that John F. O'Brien and his wife had lived in, and Forbaco has since developed it into apartments. But he and Rui, not being terribly well and needing a doctor, could see the need of a nursing home and a doctor in that area. And he did give and built that first fire station there, and then it burned and it was rebuilt. But and I believe that presently Louis would have liked to have had his money used differently, and presently it is only used as a scholarship. Yes.
You know, Addie Shields has been entering my life more and more. It seems that recently for Christmas, my daughter Barbara, from Plattsburgh, she works in the county buildings, gave me this. She said, "Dad, I hope you don't have this." And I said, "No, I've never heard of it. I did not have this." And she said, "Well, Addie Shields suggested that this," and I thought that she just saw her in a store or something. But you have these.
Well, actually, I worked with Morris Glenn, and Morris Glenn married a young lady whose father was a doctor down in the Essex, and they have a cottage down there in Essex County, and he works in the GSA. And when he worked in the GSA, these are archival materials that he found there, and they have all the lighthouses in there. And he came, wait a minute, he did have in the cellar. Now, see, money is no object to him, and so he printed these things, and then I had them for sale when I was county historian, and then I thought they were all gone. They're out of print now. And he had a box. He gave a box to the Historical Society, and I believe Helen Allen has sold hers. And then he did have some that he gave to our gentleman Breck Turner up in Lake Placid. And he came here, he had 2 boxes, and maybe I could dispose of them. Now, financially, it's nothing to me other than that he's a friend of mine. I get nothing financially for it other than it's a goodwill. And I said yes, rather than leave them in the cellar, they ought to be gotten out. And I do have, I guess, 7 more left.
Okay, so if you're interested, you check with Addie. There's an awful lot of pictures in here of buildings up and down on the lake, around Lake Champlain. Most of these are maybe from Chazy South. There's not, he's issued, I understand, 4 volumes, right?
All right. Let me say yes, because his wife's father had done a great deal of securing materials in around the lakes, especially down in Essex. So he started with volume 1 was Essex. Then here you see he dedicated to, here's the father.
Yeah, Frank. This is
Frank
Mr.
Beatty.
Dedication.
And then the other materials which were a complement to it were found in the archives, and they do have the lighthouses. And
Go ahead. He mentions in here that volume 1, volume 2 covers the lakeshore from Ticonderoga to Plattsburgh, and he's got enough material, he says, to make another one and maybe even a 4th one, which he did.
yes, and he was also interested in sunbursts. You know, it was Benjamin Franklin who, in the developed the sunburst and said that this was, in the morning, this was your possibility of the day. It was...
Sunbursts are these designs
yes.
at the gables of the various homes. And if you look, you'll see these in some of the architecture around the turn of the century. My daughter in Plattsburgh has a sunburst on the front of theirs. Yeah. In Champlain, rather, and I say Plattsburgh. Sue and Danny Belrose right next to Celine Paquette's house. And you'll see them around, and that's what they call the sunburst. And he's got a whole series of them in here, different kinds of sunbursts.
He did develop the Essex County Militia's participation in the War of 1812, and he wrote quite a book on that relative to, and I went with him over to St. Regis because he traced their march over there and back. And but anyhow, this anyone would enjoy it. It's quite a book.
Yeah, you see, like for instance, a lot of homes, you know, like that were around. Like look at here on Lake Ampersand, Saranac Lake rather. Look at the size of this building. I think that's gone now. A lot of these burned over the years, but there's some great, nice. I would assume these are in the libraries. I'm going to have to look around and see volumes 1 and 2.
I think that John Ross has one in the John Putnam Ross reference room. I believe there's one there because John bought one at the time, and
we'll take another short break and come back. And one thing we should mention, this is a good person right here, to talk a little bit about Peg Barcombe and John Ross, because those are both people, historians in our area that Addie knew very, very well and knows well. We're nearing the end of our discussion with Addie Shields, and a couple of things I want to bring up here before we do. Glenn's History of Lake Champlain, who wrote the same book, it's a different book, the same man as this, and then inside, very interesting, because these are people that I know. This book is dedicated to 4 people. Addie Shields, Dick Ward. Anybody who doesn't know Dick Ward in Plattsburgh hasn't been around books. He was in the public library for years, the county library. A good friend of mine has done given me a lot of good information and leads. And also another man I worked with for years, John Ross, a historian for the town and of Champlain and the village of Rouse's Point for years till his death, and his wife, Marcia Delano Ross, still living, and she's in her late 80s. I stopped and visit with her.
And that picture.
And their picture is right here. And very nice that this book is dedicated to them, because we certainly know all of those people helped Mr. Glenn, or anybody who's in the book business would know these 4 people. And you knew John Ross. John, for years, was our historian.
Yes, and actually, and Marcia Ross will tell you, too, that the John Putnam Ross reference room is my brainchild, because I came up there, I always go there at Christmas. I felt very badly about John's death and so forth. And that picture, I had those people for dinner here that day.
That day?
Oh, yes. And
that was taken here?
That was taken out here, right out here in front.
Oh, okay.
And they were here for dinner, and Marcia was quite well at that time.
Yes.
And we took, those are my 2 lawn chairs, and Morris Glenn and Ellie were here also, and Ellie's mother, and I'm not sure why, and that's what he wanted in that picture.
Yeah.
But I've always felt John Ross, of course, when you look at his material, what he did, he was a historian all his life, very aware of an inquisitive individual. I went up there with a voucher, a voucher to buy because he had documentary histories of New York, and there are very, very few sets of them left, and he also had Colonial Minutes by, is it McCoyne? And there are 13 volumes. John had 11 of them. And so Mrs. Ross, this was Christmas afternoon. It wasn't Christmas afternoon. She told about it at Christmas. And Rodney Ralston had been there, and Rodney Ralston bought the Revolutionary suit, which John Ross had. And he was interested in books. And so she gave me the keys to his little brakeman's house, which was set on the cement out there. And I went out there, and it's like going in a vault, because this was the way John Ross had left it. And when I saw, it's almost beyond description, when I saw the titles of what John had, all I could think of was, this is the measure of the man. This is the measure of what he's interested in. And look at the spread of it. And so when I went inside, I said to her, I don't want to buy those documentary histories. You shouldn't sell anything out of there. Let us see what we can do with it. And so then we went to Portugal, and he held us up a little bit. And then the gentleman, was it Mr. O'Neill, who followed that, but we also went to Ron Stafford. And it took a little time for Ron Stafford to get the appropriation through his pork barrel. And I remember one day I was, my office was in the circus building, and I was going through the front hall, and I saw Ron down there on the street, and so I got myself out there fast, and I ran along beside him, and I didn't want to hold him up, and I said, Ron, you haven't forgotten that. No, he said, we'll take care of it, it's just got to take time. And one of the times, I do have a picture of, the parish priest was there, and Hal Myers. And who was the priest who died?
Father Giroux.
Father Giroux and Hal Myers and Betty Miro and myself.
The library board.
With the library board, Mr. Trombley also. And I do have that picture, and I wanted to give it to Don O'Boyle. And so he promised us. It was interesting, though, what Ron knew. On the way back in the car, he said, the Miros are Democrats, aren't they? Ron would know that.
He said that.
Ron had this ability, he has this tremendous knowledge. These are nice people, And this was, well, I've known Betty Miro for a long time, too. But you see, what Ron did, irrespective, was he recognized also the worth of those books, because when McClellan's books, McClellan at one time thought of having his cemetery records and all of his library books given to Cornell, because he was a Cornell man, and then Dr. Allen Everest worked with him, and he finally decided to give them to the college, and that is very fine. But many of us, along with Larry Paquette, would have liked to have had those records kept up there in Champlain. I have always spoken of Champlain as the Gold Coast of our Clinton County, because it's quite a little area of itself, very financial, good jobs and so forth. And for the children of there with the schools, you need that reference library. So there is a John Putnam Rye reference library, which is established up there because John Ross liked books and was broad-minded and enjoyed the spread of what was going on, what was available to pick up from Colonial Minutes down through New York State documentary history and so forth, and down through our bicentennials. The other bit is that down through the bicentennials, he has, I don't know, Don could tell you, there are about 24 typewritten books.
We have 5 minutes left now, and make sure you say we don't play. We have 5 minutes left on this tape. We want to at least mention, and John Putnam Ross is in the Rouse's Point Library. Yes. His collections are in there. We should mention, I forgot also, of course, Don O'Boyle, a Citizen of the Year last year by the Chamber a year ago, and
historian of the village,
now,
my good friend,
and Peg Markham, another good friend of yours, and then her great Rouse celebration she had.
Right.
worked very, very hard, and she's feeling better now, and you see those people regularly. That's how you meet people. I'm interested in history, and if you think of history, you cannot forever forget John Ross, Donald Boyle, Peg Barcombe, and of course Addie Shields, and there are many others that I haven't mentioned.
And all the wonderful people who have plied up and down this lake, and all the economics because of the Quebec area, that center of merchandising up in Denimora, to which we responded to, that gave us all this history, and the children love this. It turns them on.
Yeah. Of course, another one very, very interested is Celine Paquette, our present village historian and town historian. Our new legislator as of today.
And you have the first Champlain monument that was ever placed in the United States. You've got it up there, and we owe it to Celine Paquette for ferreting out all that history.
Yes, she wrote a little book.
It was placed up there by St. John the Baptiste in conjunction with your people, La Fontaine and so forth, before they got this one down here, which McClellan had a part of being the architect of.
Most of them done along the lake were in 1909, the 300th anniversary. The one in Champlain was 1907. I think we're going to just about close this now. Addie, thank you very, very much.
Welcome.
We usually don't hurry like this, but we're at the end of a tape, and we hope that we could talk to you again. We'll certainly see you personally, and continued good health to you. And thank you very much for watching Hometown Cable, people, and we appreciate your comments, and we hope to have a lot of new and different things for you in 1996. And of course, some of them will be repeats. I'm sure we'll be going to Dragoons for their open house come March or April. We got to, because I like pancakes, and that's certainly a great showing there, and we're looking forward to see you there, Jack and Margaret and all the family. And we thank all the advertisers on Hometown Cable, and we hope that 1996 is as good to Hometown Cable as it is to you, and the best of health to everybody. And thank you very much for your comments and your best wishes to Hometown Cable, Calvin Castine, and the whole family.